This is what I'm calling message 18B, and it is entitled, again, it's a continuing message on the unprecedented catastrophes that will be occurring during the beginning of birth pains. Let us next talk about the famines during this period of time. Throughout history, wars have produced famines. Likewise, the catastrophic wars unleashed in the second seal will result in these unprecedented famines that are talked about in the third seal. Accordingly, in both Christ's Endtimes teaching and in his revelation, Jesus taught that after the wars, there will be famines in various places. Matthew 24, verses 6 through 7. Therefore, in Revelation 6, we read, starting in verse 5, "When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine.'" This portrays a period of severe economic hardship and the famines Jesus warned of. The Greek word means hunger or famine. Webster's defines famine as an extreme scarcity of food. Such famine will eventually lead to deaths by starvation, described in the next fourth seal. During the third seal, the desperate efforts of people to simply meet their basic physical needs will be the focus of the world. When 2 pounds of wheat will cost a day's wages, food is obviously scarce. New Testament scholar Ladd explains, grain was the main food in the ancient world, and barley was the food of poor people because it is less expensive than wheat. A quart of wheat was the average daily consumption of a man. This pictures a situation where scarcity prevails, when it would take all that a man could earn a day's wages to buy enough of the cheapest food for a small family. In ordinary times, a denarius would purchase 12 to 15 times as much food. Likewise, Robert Thomas comments, "The minimum daily food requirement of barley was 3 measures because it was cheaper than the better food, wheat. By buying the cheaper commodity, a laborer could obtain 3 measures and have enough for himself and his family, but each person received less nutritional value." So understanding the statement, "do not damage the olive oil and the wine," is more difficult. First, the Greek word here specifically means oil extracted from the fruit of the olive tree, olive oil. Therefore, versions that translate this as merely oil, such as the NIV or NASB, are not as accurate as those that have olive oil, such as the NLT or the NET. There are 2 primary interpretations of what this statement means when it says, "do not damage the olive oil in the wine." One, it's referring to basic necessities that will become valuable commodities, or 2, there will still be rich people living in luxury at this time. The first interpretation seems best. First, we should understand the meaning of the olive oil and the wine during the time that the Bible was written. At that time, they were not luxuries. Rather, they were common products used by everyone. Accordingly, Ladd writes, quote, "Oil and cheap wine were among the common necessities of life of poor people. Grain, oil, and wine is a common phrase in the Bible representing the ordinary necessities. These were the staple foods in Bible lands. They were all essential to the normal life of these countries and were not real luxuries," unquote. However, they were valuable commodities. The New Testament indicates that olive oil was used in lamps. Both were used for healing purposes. Wine was used to purify water. While valuable, there's no indication in Bible times that olive oil and the wine were luxuries primarily or only enjoyed by wealthy people. If this had been the intended meaning in Revelation chapter 6, verse 6, then it seems items such as gold and silver would have been mentioned. Therefore, their mention here points to their value as commodities of trade during a time of severe economic scarcity. The mention of a pair of scales points to this as well. As Mounts notes, quote, "The balance indicates a time of scarcity when the basic commodities of life are measured out at greatly inflated prices," unquote. And I believe commodities is the key term here. In other words, in a world where the wealth of Babylon the Great has been annihilated, commodities such as oil and wine will be valuable items of trade. The Christians living during that time in the last generation church will experience the unprecedented famines unleashed during the third seal. Therefore, it is interesting to note the promise given specifically to the Christians who will come out of the great persecution mentioned in Revelation chapter 7, verse 14, and who will have experienced the famines and struggle for basic needs during the beginning of birth pains. The promise is this: He who sits on the throne will give them shelter. They will never again be hungry or thirsty. They will never be scorched by the heat of the sun. For the Lamb on the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of life-giving water, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. That will be a comforting promise to those who are raptured at the end of these beginning of birth pains and the greatest persecution. Let's talk about other deadly catastrophes during the beginning of birth pains. Regarding the fourth seal, we read, starting in verse 7. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and therefore before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. I do not believe this is describing a mere summary of the other seals. In the fourth seal, several additional painful birth pains are mentioned. In addition, one senses an even greater increase in the intensity of the end-time birth pains with the opening of the fourth seal. For example, the severe economic scarcity in the third seal has become starvation in the fourth seal. Likewise, the war and famine of previous seals has resulted in perhaps the deadliest threat, which will be plague. Let us discuss each of these four painful birth pains that will be unleashed with the opening of the fourth seal. Being killed by sword is mentioned again. However, this is probably not referring to merely the nation against nation kind of wars unleashed in the second seal as described above. In the fourth seal, being killed by sword may also include increased violence and murders caused by the scarcity of food during this time. As noted with the opening of the fourth seal, the severe economic hardship in the third seal will eventually result in starvation and death. In addition, plague will be added to the worldwide catastrophes. The Greek word here means epidemic disease. Jesus had warned of this in Luke's version of Christ's Endtimes Teaching when he said, "There will be famines and plagues in many lands," Luke 21, verse 11. Thus, again, we see a common progression that has been demonstrated throughout human history. War leads to famine, and malnutrition leads to disease, which often kills the most people. This is reflected in scriptures. You can read Jeremiah chapter 14, verse 12, Ezekiel 5, verse 17, and Ezekiel chapter 14, verse 21 has that progression. Accordingly, John MacArthur notes, quote, "Throughout human history, disease has killed people on a far more massive scale than war. More Union and Confederate soldiers died from disease during the Civil War than they were killed in battle. An estimated 30 million people died during the great influenza epidemic of 1918 through 19, more than 3 times as many as the estimated 8.5 million soldiers who died in battle during World War I. In a world ravaged by war and famine, it is inevitable that such disease will be widespread," unquote. In the fourth seal, we also see the unleashing of earthquakes. Likewise, in Christ's Endtimes Teaching, he warned there will be great earthquakes. The end-time earthquakes could be caused by supernatural forces being exerted by God. However, there is evidence that the use of nuclear weapons could cause this as well. Many of the nuclear weapons tests that have been conducted with even small warheads have been documented to cause local earthquakes afterwards. Multi-megaton warheads could certainly do the same. The opening of the second seal will unleash catastrophic wars. These will probably include end-time Babylon being completely burned up with fire in 1 hour such that no people will ever live there again. And again, as noted, this suggests the kind of nuclear warfare that could cause such earthquakes. Finally, Revelation chapter 6, verse 8 reveals the odd prediction of people being killed by the wild beasts of the earth. This source of killing during the beginning of birth pains is not mentioned in Christ's Endtimes Teaching, but only here in his revelation. Wild beast probably simply refers to wild animals. Again, John MacArthur adds regarding the end-time unleashing of wild beasts, quote, "At first glance, the inclusion of wild beasts with war, famine, and disease seems puzzling, since most creatures dangerous to man are either extinct or isolated in unpopulated regions. But one explanation may be that the most deadly creature of all, the rat, thrives in all populated areas. Rats have been responsible for uncounted millions of deaths throughout history, both by eating food supplies and especially by spreading disease. The most infamous and devastating occurrence of rat-borne disease was the Black Death, a 14th century outbreak of bubonic plague that wiped out 1/4 to 1/3 of Europe's population. In a world ravaged by war, famine, and disease, the rat population may run wild," unquote. Because of its oddity, some have speculated that wild beasts are referring to microscopic beasts and diseases. but plagues are already mentioned in the text. It's possible that the prediction includes deadly insects. The Greek word translated wild beast means any living creature excluding humans. Indeed, mosquitoes are by far the most dangerous animal in the world, responsible for about 1 million deaths each year through infecting people with malaria and other diseases. But it would seem the primary reference here is to wild animals killing people. Even today, poisonous snakes kill 50,000 people every year, and stray rabid dogs kill another 25,000 people. A report goes on to state, quote, the crocodile is responsible for 1,000 deaths, the hippopotamus for 500 deaths, the elephant and the lion 100 each. Wolves and sharks, often villainized on TV and in movies, only cause 10 deaths each year. It would seem that during the beginning of birth pains, the divine curse on creation, as mentioned in Romans chapter 8, will come to full fruition as the wild beasts of nature become especially hostile and a significantly greater threat than today. This will be one more supernatural way that God is imposing pain on the world during the beginning of birth pains. Next, let's talk about the ongoing effect of the beginning of birth pains. Revelation chapter 6, verse 8 also describes the continuing effect of the wars, famines, plagues, earthquakes, and the deadly wild animals unleashed on the world during the beginning of birth pains. We read that death and Hades were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Notice that some of the catastrophes of the beginning of birth pains are repeated here, including war from the second seal and famine from the third seal. This suggests that the effect of the opening of a particular seal of preparation continues and even intensifies throughout the beginning of birth pains. Therefore, the effects of the beginning of birth pains and the opening of the first four seals of preparation will be massive. However, the geographical location of the catastrophes may be limited to 1/4 of the earth. The NIV expresses the more literal Greek well. Quote, death and Hades were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Of course, there is some debate about what a fourth of the earth means here. The Greek word for earth can mean either one, the place where humanity lives, earth, or two, the inhabitants of the earth, people. Therefore, is this 1/4 of the earth to be understood geographically or numerically? Most commentators claim it refers to 1/4 of the world's population. Therefore, it is commonly concluded that with a current population of the world at around 8 billion people, the text is predicting the death of about that many people of about 2 billion people during the beginning of birth pains. Unfortunately, these same commentators do not offer any arguments for this view and seem to assume it is correct. There are reasons to suggest otherwise. In the very same verse, earth refers to the planet, not people, when it refers to wild beasts of the earth, using the same Greek word. If earth means the planet in the second part of the verse, this is an argument that it means the planet in the first part of the verse. Therefore, 1/4 of the earth would refer to 1/4 of the geographical area of the planet, rather than the population. Likewise, a short time later in the Revelation, the very next statement like this is in chapter 8, verse 7. There we read of the first trumpet punishment when a third of the earth was burned up. Here, earth clearly refers to a geographical area, not people. This is the case with all of the multiple occurrences to a portion of the earth in Revelation. Finally, when Revelation is referring to a portion of humanity, it makes this clear by twice using the phrase to kill 1/3 of all the people on earth. Therefore, if John had meant a third of humanity or the population in Revelation chapter 6, verse 8, it seems he would have specified it as he does in Revelation chapter 9. These characteristics of the Revelation suggest that in 6:8, 1/4 of the earth refers to a geographical area of the earth. This interpretation of Revelation 6:8 may also equate to approximately 2 billion people. But the emphasis on a specific geographic area of the earth seems to suggest that deaths will not be evenly distributed in the world. In other words, the deaths from the wars, famines, plagues, and earthquakes may be concentrated in specific continents of the earth. Therefore, a great many people, in fact, perhaps even all people, living in that 1/4 of the earth's geography will be killed. This seems to be what is being referred to when we read, death and Hades were given a power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. For example, it seems those killed by war will be primarily in this 1/4 of the earth. Therefore, the other 75% of the earth will not physically experience these end time wars. This would reflect Christ's statement that in the end times, many people will merely hear reports of these wars as discussed above. The fact that these wars may be confined to 1/4 of the earth is another indication that the great majority of these deaths will occur in the apparent destruction of end-time Babylon and its place and people with nuclear weapons. Again, where and what end-time Babylon will be is the topic of another book. Likewise, it seems Africa will be a part of the 1/4 of the earth where virtually all of its people will die during the beginning of birth pains. This is because it will be especially hit hard by the famine. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Africa imported about 85% of its food in 2016 to 18 from outside the continent. This amounted to $35 billion and is expected to reach $110 billion by the year 2025. In a world suffering from the severe economic scarcity of the third seal, famine will probably affect Africa more than any other place on the earth because of its dependence for food on the rest of the world even now. Therefore, it is possible that what can be called the remaining world will not have many or any people living in end-time Babylon or Africa. The remaining world is the world that exists after the beginning of birth pains and these first 4 seals are completed. It is the 75% of the geographical earth that will not have its population wiped out in the wars, famines, and plagues of the first 4 seals. Therefore, the remaining world that Antichrist will rule over may not include the place and people of end-time Babylon or Africa, as they may be the 1/4 of the earth that is killed during the beginning of birth pains. The remaining world where remnant Christians will face the greatest persecution may not include these places on earth either. The Christians living there may have already died in the wars, famines, and plagues of the first 4 seals. It has been noted that many people believe and teach that these seals in the beginning of birth pains have already occurred or been occurring throughout church history or even now. But the magnitude of the 4th seal disproves this. MacArthur is correct to note against the historical view of the beginning of birth pains in Revelation chapter 6, quote, "The first 4 seals clearly describe awe-inspiring, frightening judgments without parallel in human history. There's nothing that has happened since John had this vision that could be the fulfillment of these judgments," unquote. Therefore, focusing on how mere shadows of the beginning of birth pains have occurred in human history does little to help the church prepare for the great darkness that is coming. But unfortunately, many scholars focus on those mere shadows. Regardless of whether the 1/4 of people being killed refers to population or geography, there's not been a period of history when anything close to this has ever happened. And it certainly is not happening today. These unprecedented horrors will occur sometime in the future, perhaps even your future, which is why an important question is addressed in the last message of this series. Are you ready for the end times? Before that, I have one more message in this series. I want to offer a broad outline of the suggested sequence of 25 events in the end times and the duration of those events. This will give you an overall perspective on virtually all of the major end time events predicted for the church and Gentile nations. It's rather breathtaking to put it all together, as we will attempt to do so in the next message.